I have always been careful, that is not a small thing to say. Careful is not something I stumbled into, the way other people stumble into good habits or good fortune. Careful is something I built, brick by brick, over the better part of a decade, starting from the morning I was 17 years old and sitting in the office of a school counselor who looked at my file the wrong way. Not a mean way. Not a cruel way. Just the way that people look at things that complicate their understanding of the world, the way they look at something unexpected and have to spend a moment reorganizing their interior furniture to make room for it. I swore to myself that morning that nobody would ever look at me that way again. So I was careful, I took the suppressants every morning without fail. I kept the prescription filed under a different name at a pharmacy 2 neighborhoods over from my apartment. I wore neutralizing cologne, not the kind that smelled like anything in particular, just the kind that flattened everything out, that turned me into a blank, olfactory nothing. I kept my office thermostat set lower than everyone else liked, because warmth accelerated things. I ate in a way that kept my body chemistry stable, avoided alcohol almost entirely, slept 8 hours a night because exhaustion was the enemy of control, for 6 years working at Hargrove and Associates, an architecture and design consultancy firm on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. I had been exactly what I appeared to be. A competent, quiet, somewhat reserved project coordinator who got his work done on time, kept excellent documentation, made decent coffee when it was his turn in the rotation, and went home at 6:15 every single evening. I was not interesting. I did not intend to be interesting, and then came the Tuesday in November that changed every single one of those carefully constructed facts about my life. It started with my phone. My phone is one of those slim, charcoal gray models that several million other people own, because I bought it specifically because several million other people own it. It has a plain dark case because I owned a plain dark case. There is nothing identifying about it from a distance of more than 3 feet. This was, as it turned out, both the cause of the problem and the reason the problem went as far as it did. I had set it on the break room counter at 11:40 that morning while I was making myself a cup of tea. I remember this distinctly. I remember the thin clink of my ceramic mug against the countertop, I remember the small cloud of steam that rose from the kettle, I remember the particular quality of the November light coming through the break room window, gray and flat and very still, the way light gets when it has given up trying to be cheerful. I was thinking about the Kelsey mixed-use project, which had run 3 weeks over schedule because the structural engineer had changed his mind about the load-bearing specifications on the 4th floor, and which was now my responsibility to diplomatically explain to a client who had the patience of a man who had been promised something and not received it. I was not thinking about my phone. I made my tea. I walked back to my desk. At 12:30, my phone was not in my pocket. I did a full circuit of my desk, checking every surface and every drawer, with the growing, particular dread of a person who already knows where they left something but is hoping very much that they are wrong. I walked to the break room. The counter was clean. Someone had wiped it down. My phone was gone. I stood there for a moment, doing the arithmetic of the situation. The break room had been used by 4 other people since I had been in there, based on the voices I had heard through the thin interior wall of my office. 3 of them I had seen leave with their belongings. The 4th was Marvin Conrad. My stomach did the thing it always did when I thought about Marvin Conrad, which was to clench in a way that was equal parts professional anxiety and something else that I had been resolutely not examining for approximately 2 years. Marvin Conrad was the lead architect at Hargrove and Associates. He was 6'2", broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that he kept short on the sides and slightly longer on top, and a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone who took the concept of a jaw very seriously. He had amber-brown eyes that caught the light in a way that was frankly unfair, and a voice that sat comfortably in the low register of things that made your nervous system pay attention. He was also an alpha, and not a quiet one. Not aggressive, not pushy, nothing like that. Marvin Conrad was the kind of alpha who seemed genuinely unaware of the effect his presence had on a room, which somehow made it worse. He would walk into a site meeting and every conversation in the space would recalibrate slightly. The way a compass recalibrates when you bring a magnet near it. He never raised his voice. He never had to. When Marvin Conrad said something, people listened, and they did not examine too closely why they were so willing to do so. I had spent 2 years being very, very careful around Marvin Conrad specifically. He had a phone that was the same model as mine, in a similar dark case, because apparently my strategy of blending in was not as unique as I had imagined. I went to his office. The door was open. He was standing at his drafting table with his back to me, phone pressed to his ear, the broad line of his shoulders visible through the fitted charcoal fabric of his shirt. He turned when he heard me at the door. And the expression on his face was one I had never seen him wear before in 2 years of working in the same office. It was not his usual calm, focused attention. It was something more cautious than that. Something more careful. He held up one finger, the gesture for one moment, and then he said into the phone, "Yes, I understand, thank you for clarifying." And he ended the call. He looked at me for a long second before he spoke, then he said, "I believe I have your phone." He was holding it out to me. My phone, dark case, charcoal gray, sitting in his large palm. I crossed the office and took it from him. Our fingers did not touch. I was very consciously aware of the fact that our fingers did not touch. I said, "I believe you have the same model." "It is a common mix-up," he said. Yes. There was a silence. He was still looking at me with that unfamiliar expression, and the quality of the silence was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses against the walls of the room. I was about to say thank you and leave, which is exactly what I should have done, when he said, "Seth." He had never called me by my first name before. In 2 years of working together, it had always been Myers, or a nod, or nothing at all because we were both in the same meeting and the conversation addressed the room. Hearing my name in his voice was like stepping off a curb you did not know was there. I said, "Yes," he said, "I owe you an apology," I said, "for taking the wrong phone." "It is fine. It is a common mix-up," he said, "not just for that," and then he told me that he had picked up the phone from the break room counter, thinking it was his. He had put it in his pocket without looking at it closely. He had been in a meeting for 40 minutes, and when the meeting ended, his phone had buzzed in his pocket. He had taken it out and looked at the screen, and realized immediately from the lock screen image that it was not his, because his lock screen was a photograph of a building he admired and mine was, apparently, the default gradient that I had never changed. He had been about to bring it to lost and found when the phone rang. He had answered it by reflex. A reflex he regretted immediately, he said, and the regret was visible in every line of his face as he said it. It had been a recorded voice, the automated message of a medical clinic. And it had said my name, and it had said that my recent blood work results were available through the patient portal, and that my prescription for designation-suppressing medication was due for renewal, and that I was reminded of my 6-month checkup appointment, which had been rescheduled to the following Thursday at 3 in the afternoon. It had said the name of the clinic. It had said everything. He had ended the call within the first 10 seconds, he said. The moment he understood what he was hearing. He ended it. But the first 10 seconds had been enough. I stood in his office and held my phone and felt the very particular sensation of something you have spent years building beginning to come apart, not all at once, not dramatically, just the first quiet shift of a foundation stone. I said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, "How much did you hear?" He said, "Enough to understand that this is something you keep private. And I want you to know that it stays with me. Completely. I have no intention of discussing it with anyone, and I have no intention of changing how I treat you or how I see you. I wanted to tell you directly because I thought you deserved to know, rather than wondering." I looked at him, he looked back at me. I said, "Thank you," he said, "I am sorry, Seth." Genuinely. I nodded, took my phone, and walked back to my office and closed the door. Then I sat at my desk and spent 10 minutes doing the kind of very controlled, very quiet breathing that I had gotten quite good at over the years, the kind you do when you need to keep your hands from shaking and your eyes from doing anything that would later embarrass you. The thing was, the genuinely terrible thing, the thing that sat underneath all of the fear and the exposure and the very justified anxiety of what had just happened, was that the worst part of it was not the exposure itself. The worst part was the way he had said my name, Seth, low and even and careful, like he was aware of exactly how much weight the word was carrying. I had been careful for 6 years. And in 40 minutes and a wrong phone and an automated voicemail. Everything I had built had its first crack. I avoided him for 2 days. This was not difficult, technically. Our offices were on the same floor but at opposite ends of the hall, and our work overlapped enough to require coordination but not constant contact. I rerouted the 2 emails I would normally have sent him directly through our shared project management platform instead, which was professional and reasonable and also completely transparent to anyone paying attention, because I never normally use the platform for things that simple. I do not know if he was paying attention. I suspected he was. On Thursday, the day of my rescheduled appointment, I was at my desk at 7 in the morning because I had not slept well and coming in early seemed better than lying in the dark examining the ceiling. The office was empty and gray with early light, and I had made myself coffee and was sitting with the pretense of reviewing the Kelsey project files when I heard the elevator at the end of the hall open. Only one other person came in this early. I kept my eyes on my screen. His footsteps were distinctive, unhurried and even, and they paused for just a moment outside my office door before continuing down the hall. Then there was the sound of his office door opening and closing, and the building was quiet again. I let out a breath. At 8:30, there was a knock at my door. I said come in, and it was not Marvin Conrad, it was Dessa, our office manager, a small energetic woman with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, holding a folder and looking distracted. She needed my signature on a procurement form. I signed it. She left. I returned to not really reading the Kelsey files. At 9, there was another knock. This one was different. It had a different weight to it, a different quality of patience in the pause that followed it. I said come in. He came in. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which I had not expected, and he set one on the corner of my desk without making a production of it, the way you might set something down that you hope the other person will simply accept without having to formally acknowledge. He said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." He sat in the chair across from my desk, which was the chair that clients and consultants used, which nobody from the office ever used, because nobody from the office ever came to sit in my office, and looked at me with that same careful amber gaze. He said, "I am not here to make this uncomfortable." I said, "You are not making it uncomfortable." He said, "You have been sending me platform messages for 2 days." I said, "It seemed like the appropriate channel." He said, "Seth." There was my name again. I put both hands flat on the desk, which was a grounding technique, and focused on the temperature of the desk surface beneath my palms. I said, "Marvin, I appreciate what you said the other day. I believe that you meant it. The situation was unexpected for both of us and I am working through it at my own pace." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough." He did not leave, though. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it thoughtfully, the way a person looks at something when they are organizing their thoughts and using the object as a placeholder for their attention. Then he said, "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me to mind my own business and I will." I said, "You can ask." He said, "How long?" I said, 6 years. "Since before I came to work here." He nodded slowly. Not with pity. With something more like understanding, like a person doing math and arriving at a number that explains something they had noticed but not put together. He said, "That must be very tiring." I had not expected that. I had expected something else, something more in the category of questions about my health or my choices or my reasons. The direct simplicity of what he actually said landed in the middle of my chest in a way I was not prepared for. I said, "Yes. It is. Sometimes," he said, "you do not have to explain anything to me. I just wanted you to know that I see it. That it costs you something. And that I respect what it costs you." I looked at him across the desk. The morning light was coming in at a low angle through my window, casting long shadows across the floor, and he sat in it very steadily, like a person who was accustomed to holding still when other people needed them to. I said, "Why are you being this kind to me?" He said, "Because it seems like you have not encountered it very frequently on this particular subject, and it seems like you could use some." I did not have anything to say to that. I picked up the coffee cup he had brought me, which was made exactly the way I liked it, which meant he had been paying more attention over 2 years than I had given him credit for, and I drank from it. He stayed for another 20 minutes. We talked about the Kelsey project, because there was genuine work to do, and the conversation was normal and professional, and there was something extraordinarily strange about how relieved I was to have a normal conversation with him. When he left, he said he would see me at the afternoon briefing, and I said yes, and he closed the door behind him, and I sat with the coffee cup in my hands and thought about the way he had said it must be very tiring. Nobody had ever said that to me before. I went to my appointment at 3. It was routine. My levels were stable, my prescription was renewed, my doctor reminded me about vitamin D supplementation and regular exercise, which I was already doing. I was back at my desk by 4:30. There was a platform message from Marvin Conrad. It read, "The Kelsey client called." I told him the revised timeline and he accepted it without argument. "Thought you would want to know so you can stop worrying about it." I had not told him I was worrying about it. I typed back, "Thank you." "That is a relief," he replied. "Good. Go home at a reasonable hour." I stared at that message for a full minute, then I closed the platform window and went back to work, and I left at 6:15, exactly as I always did, and on the walk to the subway I thought about reasonable hours and amber eyes and the particular quality of a silence that has weight in it, and I told myself very firmly that I was not in any danger of doing something unwise. I told myself this for approximately the next 3 weeks, with diminishing conviction. What happened next did not happen quickly. I want to be clear about that, because the story of two people coming together is often told as if it has a momentum to it. As if once certain things are set in motion they proceed inevitably, the way water runs downhill. That was not how it was with Marvin Conrad and me. What happened between us happened the way good architecture happens, slowly, with attention paid to every joint and load and structural consideration, with a great deal of time spent looking at drawings before anyone picks up a tool. He did not push. This is the thing I noticed first, and then kept noticing, because it was so different from what I had spent my adult life bracing against. When I was quiet, he was quiet. When I steered a conversation away from something personal, he let it go without comment. He gave me room, and the room was not indifference. It was the deliberate, attentive kind of space that a person makes for you when they have decided you are worth making space for. We started having lunch together, which was not a formal arrangement and was not ever named as such. It simply began happening, the way things begin to happen when two people who work near each other and find each other's company tolerable start converging in the same spaces at the same times. He brought sandwiches on Tuesdays because he passed a particular deli on his commute. I started making enough tea for 2 on Thursday afternoons when I knew the building was too cold and he had been out at site visits all morning and came back looking like he had been standing in the wind for 3 hours. Which he usually had been. We talked about work, at first. We talked about the industry, about projects we had worked on before Hargrove, about approaches to client management and the particular madness of zoning regulations. He was thoughtful and specific and he listened as carefully as he spoke, which is rarer than it should be in a person, and then, gradually, we began to talk about other things. He told me that he had grown up moving frequently, that his family had relocated 7 times before he finished high school, and that this was why he had become an architect. He said there was something about the idea of making permanent structures that appealed to a person whose childhood had been mostly temporary. He said it in a matter-of-fact way, without self-pity, the way you tell a thing when you have made peace with it. I told him that I had always been the kind of person who made plans. That I had a 5-year plan at 16, and a revised 5-year plan at 21, and that most of the plans had worked out reasonably well except for the parts of life that plans cannot account for, which turned out to be quite large portions of it. He asked what I meant by the parts that plans cannot account for. I said, people, mostly. People are very difficult to plan for. He looked at me over his sandwich with an expression that I was becoming better at reading, which was a slight shift in the set of his jaw and a particular quality of steadiness in his gaze that meant he was hearing something I had not quite said out loud yet. He said, I imagine that is especially true when you are spending energy managing what people know about you. I said, yes. It makes everything more complicated, he said. Does it have to be? I said, I have found it is safer. He said, safer than what? I said, than the alternative. He considered this. Then he said, has the alternative always been bad? I said, not always. But often enough. He nodded. He did not argue with this. He did not tell me that people were generally good or that I was being too careful or that the world had changed. He simply accepted the truth of my experience as the truth of my experience, and this was something I had not known I needed until he gave it to me. I went home that evening and stood in my kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just standing, which is something I did sometimes when I was processing something my mind had not caught up to yet. I thought about safety. About the particular kind of safe that was also a cage. About the 6 years of mornings with the suppressant and the neutralizing cologne and the thermostat set lower than was comfortable, and about whether any of those things had actually made me safe or whether they had simply made me invisible, and whether invisible and safe were the same thing, and whether they needed to be. I thought about Marvin Conrad sitting across from me and asking, has it always been bad? With the same tone of voice he used when he was asking a structural question about a building, genuinely curious, genuinely interested in the actual answer. I thought, this man is going to be a problem. I thought, he already is. December came in with cold and the particular busyness of the end of a fiscal year, and the office ran faster and louder, and I found that the lunch arrangements became more important to me, not less, because the hour of relative quiet in his company had become the place in my day that I rested. I want to stop and examine that word, rested, because I think it is the most accurate one. It was not that I did not enjoy other parts of my day. I liked my work. I was good at it and I found genuine satisfaction in it. But the effort of existing as I existed, of managing the constant low-level vigilance of my daily presentation, was a weight I carried so constantly that I had stopped noticing it as a weight and had simply incorporated it into my sense of what standing upright felt like. With Marvin, I put it down, not entirely. Not all at once. But something about the way he had received the knowledge of what I was, with no visible reaction except care, had made a small change in the architecture of my vigilance. There was one person in my life who knew, who sat across from me with lunch and talked about structural tolerances, who had not changed in any perceptible way since the Tuesday in November with the wrong phone and the automated message. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, rather a great deal. On the second Tuesday of December, we were both working late, which was not unusual in the end-of-year rush, and we ended up in the break room at the same time at 7:30 in the evening when everyone else had gone home. He was making coffee, real coffee this time, not tea, because he said he had 2 more hours of drawings to review. I was looking in the refrigerator at the remains of my lunch and deciding whether I was hungry enough to eat them or tired enough to simply go home. He said, "Have you eaten dinner?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "There is a noodle place 2 blocks west that is still open. It takes 20 minutes and then you can come back if you need to. Or go home. Either way you would have eaten." I said, "Are you asking me to dinner?" He turned from the coffee maker and looked at me, and the expression was that careful one again, the one with the steady amber attention, and he said, "Yes. I am. If you would like to go," the way he framed it. "If you would like." Putting the choice clearly in my hands, not as a polite formality but as a genuine offer that genuinely could be declined without consequence, I said, "All right." He said, "Good. Give me 5 minutes." We walked 2 blocks in the cold to the noodle place, which was small and warm and smelled extraordinarily good, and we sat at a corner table and ordered, and then we talked for 2 hours without either of us noticing that it had been 2 hours until the server came by for the 3rd time with a look that was very politely suggesting we might want to allow someone else to have the table. He walked me to the subway. It was cold enough that our breath made small clouds in the dark air, and the streetlights were putting halos on everything, and the city was quieter than it usually was at this hour, muffled by the kind of cold that keeps people indoors. He stopped at the subway entrance and said, "I would like to do this again." "If you are willing," I said. "I think I am." He said, "Good night, Seth." I said, "Good night, Marvin." I went down the subway stairs and got on the train and sat with my hands folded in my lap all the way home, looking at nothing in particular, and I thought, I am in a considerable amount of trouble. The thought arrived without the fear that usually accompanied it. We saw each other outside the office 3 more times before the end of December, once for coffee on a Saturday, which was brief and easy and felt like something we had been doing for much longer than we had. Once for a gallery showing downtown, which he had extra tickets for and mentioned without pressure, and which turned out to be an exhibition of architectural photography that we moved through for 2 hours arguing amicably about framing and light and what it meant to photograph a space meant for human bodies without including any human bodies in it. Once for a long walk along the waterfront that started because I mentioned I usually walked on Sunday mornings and he said he did too. And somehow the following Sunday morning we were both walking, and neither of us had formally arranged it. He did not push. I keep returning to this because it remained consistently true in a way that I kept waiting to see the exception to, and the exception did not come. He did not ask me to explain myself. He did not ask questions about my designation that I had not already volunteered. He did not try to navigate around the topic in a way that called attention to the navigating, which was its own kind of pressure. He simply treated me like a person whose full context he was getting to know at the pace I was willing to offer it, and treated the pieces he knew as belonging to a whole that he respected. I am aware that this sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. On the last Saturday before Christmas, we were sitting in a coffee shop with the windows fogged from the cold outside and the sound of other people's quiet conversations around us, and I looked at him across the table and I thought about the question he had asked in the break room, weeks ago now, when I had said that keeping people at a distance was safer. Safer than what? He had asked. I said, "Can I tell you something?" He looked up from his coffee. He said, "Yes," I said, "I have been managing my designation privately for 6 years. I am good at it. I have a system and it works. But it also means that there is almost no one in my life who knows the full version of who I am. I have colleagues and I have people I see occasionally and I have the usual texture of an adult life, but I have kept this part at a very significant distance from all of it. And I have told myself that this is reasonable and safe and sustainable." I paused. He was very still across the table, listening with his whole attention the way he did. I said, "I am telling you this because you already know one piece of it, and because the way you handled knowing that piece has made me want to keep talking to you. Which is not something I expected. And I think you should know that I am aware of the position that puts me in, and I am not unaware of the possible complications, and I am going in with my eyes open. I just wanted you to know that I know." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I know what you are telling me. And I want to tell you something in return, if you will let me." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I have been aware of you since approximately your 3rd week at Hargrove. I want to be honest about that. The way you work, the way you think, the care you bring to things. I noticed. I have been noticing for 2 years. And when I accidentally learned something about you that you had not chosen to share, my first feeling was not anything about your designation. My first feeling was that I had inadvertently taken something from you that was yours to decide when and whether to give. And that felt like a kind of harm, and I wanted to make it right." He set his coffee cup down. He said, "Everything that has happened since then has been because I wanted to know you. The person across the table. The one who makes tea with exact precision and argues about load-bearing specifications and walks on Sunday mornings and keeps his plans in color-coded folders and looks at old buildings like they owe him an answer to a question he has been asking for years. That person. Your designation is a part of you and I do not dismiss it and I am not pretending it does not exist. But it is not the reason I am sitting here." The coffee shop was warm and quiet around us. I said, "That is a very thorough answer." He said, "I have been thinking about it for a while." I said, "How long?" He said, "Since approximately the first coffee." "Which was several weeks ago," I said, "and you did not say anything." He said, "It did not seem like the right moment." "You were still deciding whether to trust me," I said, "and now," he said, "you are still deciding." "But I thought you should have more information." I looked at him. He looked back at me with that patient, steady quality that I was beginning to understand was not a personality trait so much as a deliberate choice, the same choice that went into everything else about him, the attention he brought to his work, the care he took with his words, the way he moved through a space as if he had already thought through all the ways he could take up too much of it and had decided not to. I said, "Marvin," he said. "Seth," I said, "I would like you to come for a walk with me on Sunday." He said, "I would like that very much." We stayed in the coffee shop for another hour and a half, until the afternoon light was gone and the city was dark outside the fogged windows, and we talked about everything and nothing, the way you talk when you are no longer managing the conversation and are simply living in it. And when we finally left and stood on the cold sidewalk he looked at me for a moment before he said goodnight, and the look was the kind that carries a question it is not quite ready to ask yet. I walked home through the December dark and thought, I am going to let this happen. I thought it with a steadiness that surprised me. The Sunday walk became a standing arrangement. Every Sunday morning at 8, the waterfront. We walked for an hour or two, in the cold and then in the slightly less cold as January gave way to February and the quality of the light began to change. On our 5th Sunday walk, in the middle of January, I told him about the school counselor's office. About being 17 and watching a person reorganize their interior furniture to make room for me, and what I had decided that morning. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That is a very heavy thing to carry at 17, I said, "I managed," he said, "I know you did. You are extraordinarily capable of managing. I am just saying it was heavy, and you did not have to carry it alone, and I am sorry that the people in your life at the time were not able to give you a better option." We walked in silence for a while after that. The water was very still and silver in the morning light, and there were a few birds very far away, and the cold was the kind that clarifies everything it touches. Then he said, "You do not have to carry it alone now, either. If you do not want to," I said. "I am aware of that," he said, "I know. I just wanted to say it in case you needed to hear it." In February, he came to my apartment for dinner. I cooked, which I am genuinely good at. And he sat on the other side of my kitchen island and watched me cook with an expression of such complete contentment that I had to turn back to the stove and focus on the onions so that he would not see my face doing something embarrassing. He looked at my apartment carefully, the way he looked at everything, and said, "This is a very organized home." I said, "I know," he said. "It looks like someone who knows exactly what they want and exactly how they want it." I said, "Is that a criticism?" He said, "Not in the slightest." After dinner we sat on my couch with the remainder of a bottle of wine and he told me about the first building he had ever designed professionally, a small community center that had been built on a very limited budget with a very involved client committee. And about the specific kind of satisfaction it had given him to stand in a finished space and know that real people would move through it. He talked about it with a warmth that was different from his usual manner, softer and less measured, and I listened and thought about the fact that this was a person revealing something to me, that this was mutual, that we were doing this together. At some point the conversation slowed and then stopped, the comfortable kind of stop, and we were simply sitting in my living room in the quiet, and he was close enough that I could have put my head on his shoulder without moving very much. I did not. But I thought about it. When he left, he stopped at the door and turned and looked at me. And there was something in the amber of his eyes that was very still and very warm and very much the question I had seen forming for weeks. He said, "I am going to tell you something and you can do whatever you want with it." I said, "All right," he said, "I want to be with you. I want that in a clear and unambiguous way and I have wanted it for some time. I am not going to push you. I know you have your own pace and your own reasons for moving at it, and I respect them completely. But I did not want to let more time go by without being honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty." I stood in the doorway of my apartment and looked at him. He said, "You do not have to say anything right now." I said, "I know." He said good night and left, and I closed the door and stood on my side of it for a long moment, then I opened the door. He was halfway down the hall. I said, "Marvin." He stopped and turned. I said, "I know. I want to be with you too. I have known for a while. I have just been working up to it." He stood in the hallway and looked at me, and the look was the one I had been watching build for months, warm and steady and carrying a very specific quality of relief. He said, "I can work with that." I said, "I thought you might." He walked back to the door. He stopped directly in front of me. He was close enough now that I could see the particular way the light in the hallway caught the angle of his jaw. And his warmth was very present, and the effect of it on my system was the kind I had been carefully managing and was now, consciously, choosing not to manage. He said, "Can I?" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I said, "Yes." He kissed me. It was exactly what I should have known it would be. Unhurried, deliberate, impossibly warm. He kissed me the way he did everything, with complete attention, as if there were nothing else in the world that required his consideration at that moment. His hand came up to cup my jaw, careful and steady, and I stood in my own doorway and let him, and the thing in my chest that had been wound tight for 6 years or possibly 27 let go. Just slightly, just enough to breathe. When we separated, he looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I have been wanting to do that for a very long time." I said, "It was worth waiting for." He smiled. It was a full, real smile, not the measured professional expression I saw at work, but an unguarded thing that changed his whole face, and I stored it carefully in the part of me that collects things I intend to return to. He said good night again, and this time I let him go, and I closed the door and stood in my own apartment with my fingers at my lips and thought about the fact that I had just made a decision I could not take back. I was not afraid of it. That was new. What followed was not without its complications. I want to be clear about that too, because a story that pretends life becomes simple after two people decide they want each other does no service to anyone. Things do not become simple. They become differently complicated, in ways that are worth the complication, which is a different thing. I had 6 years of practiced privacy to unpeel. This did not happen overnight. There were moments when I defaulted to the familiar distances, when something tender or vulnerable would approach the surface and I would redirect with precision, the way you redirect water with a well-placed barrier, and Marvin would notice, and would let it go, and then sometime later, in a quieter moment, would come back to it from a slightly different angle. Patient as a geologist working a rock face, he never made me feel like a problem to be solved. He made me feel like something worth knowing, which is not the same thing, and the difference mattered enormously. I started telling him things. Small things first, then larger ones. About the years of careful management and what it had cost me, about the relationships I had kept at a certain depth because going deeper meant risk, about the particular loneliness of being very competent and very alone with the most important fact about yourself. He listened. He shared things back. He told me about his own failures and uncertainties, about the projects that had not gone well, about his family and the ways they were complicated. About the particular pressure of being an alpha in a field that expected certain things of that and the ways he had both met those expectations and found them insufficient. He was not performing vulnerability. He was simply being honest, and inviting me into the space that honesty creates between two people. By March, I had reduced my neutralizing cologne to a fraction of its former quantity. This was a deliberate choice, arrived at after a great deal of consideration, and when I came to work one morning without it, or with much less of it, I spent the first hour braced for something, I was not sure what. A look. A change in the room. Something to tell me that it was a mistake. Marvin came by my office at 10 for a project question. He stopped in the doorway, and for just a moment, something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Just a softening, a warmth, there and then gone, receding back into his professional composure. He asked his project question. I answered it. He thanked me and left. At lunch he set down his coffee and said, "You changed something today." I said, "Yes." He said, "It is your choice entirely." "I want you to know that." I said, "I know." "It is," he said. Good. He did not make more of it than that. He did not need to. By April, I had told the two people in my personal life who I was closest to, a childhood friend who called me on Sunday evenings, and a cousin I had always been particularly close to. Both conversations were different. Both were easier than I had expected. My friend said, "I already knew, I was waiting for you to tell me," with a matter-of-factness that made me laugh out loud for the first time in what felt like a very long time. My cousin cried. Not with pity but with something more like grief for the years I had spent hidden, and then said, "You do not have to do that anymore," and I thought about Marvin saying it on the waterfront in January, and thought, I am beginning to understand that, by May, I had reduced the suppressants to the minimum maintenance dose, because my doctor and I had talked about what level of management was genuinely about health and what level was about fear, and had agreed that fear was not a good governing principle for medical decisions. The reduction was gradual and monitored and sensible. My body, relieved of 6 years of suppression, spent a few weeks being somewhat unpredictable, which was inconvenient and occasionally uncomfortable but also, underneath all of that, a relief that was difficult to articulate. Like a noise you have been living with for so long you stopped hearing it, suddenly gone, Marvin noticed. He did not comment on the specifics. He did comment, one evening in my apartment when we were sitting after dinner and I was more tired than usual, that I seemed like I was going through something and that he was here if there was anything he could do. I said, "It is manageable. My body is just adjusting to some changes I have made." He said, "Do you need anything?" I said, "This is fine. Being here is fine." He moved slightly, creating space against his side, and I leaned into it, and he put his arm around me, easy and uncomplicated. And we stayed like that for a long time without talking, and it was the most comfortable I had been in a body I had spent years treating primarily as a management challenge. We had been together, formally, with that word agreed upon and accurate, since February. It was May, and we had not had the full conversation. I knew it was coming. I was not afraid of it, exactly, but it was a significant conversation, the kind that has consequences, the kind that asks both people to say what they actually want rather than dancing around the outline of it. He brought it up on a Sunday. Not the waterfront, this time, but my apartment, because it had rained since early morning and we had decided to stay in. We were in the kitchen, I was making something complicated with eggs and herbs, and he was sitting at the island with the Sunday paper, or rather he was sitting with the Sunday paper and watching me, which I had become accustomed to in the way you become accustomed to something that you have decided you do not mind. He said, "I would like to talk about something if you are willing." I said, "Go ahead." I kept my eyes on what I was doing. He said, "I want to ask you what you want. Long term. Not a gotcha question, not a test. I just think we are at a point where I would like to know, and I would like to tell you, and having that conversation seems better than not having it." I put down what I was doing. I turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. I said, "I want to be with you. In a real way. Not a careful, managed, distance-maintained way. I have spent a long time doing that version of things and I am prepared to stop." He held my gaze. He said, "What does the real way look like to you?" I said, "It looks like what we have been doing. Plus all the parts one have been slightly too careful about still. It looks like not managing the distance anymore. It looks like letting this be what it is, which is the most significant thing in my life currently, with the full weight that deserves." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I want the same thing. I want all of it. The full version. I want to know you completely and I want you to know me completely, and I want us to build something with those two complete people rather than the polished professional versions of them." I said, "That is a very architectural framing." He said, "It is a very accurate one." I said, "Yes. I know. I like it." He came around the island and stood in front of me, and his hands came up to frame my face with that same care he had brought to the first kiss, gentle and steady, and he looked at me with the full amber warmth of his attention and said, "I love you, Seth." I had known it was coming. I had known it for weeks, in the way you know things you're not quite ready to confront directly but that are simply true. Running parallel to your consciousness until you are ready to look at them. I said, "I love you too, Marvin. I have for a while." I was working up to saying it. He said, "I know." I said, "Stop knowing things before I say them." He said, "I will make no such promise." He kissed me again, there in my kitchen with something half finished on the stove, and I kissed him back with the full and unmanaged weight of 6 years of careful distance, now done with. It tasted like an end and a beginning simultaneously. Summer came and everything was different and also very much the same. We were still colleagues. We were still professional at work, because both of us had a great deal of respect for the boundary between the personal and the professional. And because neither of us had any interest in making our coworkers uncomfortable. We were appropriately discreet. Dessa, the office manager, figured it out by June because Dessa figured everything out, and her response was to bring both of us a small plate of homemade cookies on a Tuesday and say nothing whatsoever about it, which was the most thoughtful possible response. Outside the office, we were simply ourselves. We spent weekends between his apartment and mine, because we had both agreed we were adults with established homes and there was no reason to rush the geography of a shared life before we were both certain of what shape it should take. We cooked together, we argued about films. We walked on Sunday mornings and now held hands doing it, which made the walk somewhat different in character. We went to see his family in the spring, a visit I had dreaded somewhat and which turned out to be fine. His family was warm and somewhat boisterous and his younger sister immediately decided she approved of me, which she communicated by asking me detailed questions about my work for 40 minutes and then telling Marvin I was smart, as if this were the relevant metric, which was charming. He met my cousin in July. They got along immediately and almost alarmingly well, which meant I spent the dinner listening to two people who should have been separately familiar with me comparing notes on me from a position of combined superior knowledge. Which was its own kind of experience. I reduced the maintenance dose again in June. My doctor and I agreed it was going well. I felt, genuinely and not as a managed performance of feeling, well. I felt like myself, whatever that meant exactly, which was something I was in the ongoing process of discovering now that I had stopped arranging everything to prevent anyone from seeing it. Marvin was part of that discovery. This surprised me, because I had expected the process of being known to feel like exposure, and exposure is not comfortable. What it actually felt like, at least in his presence, was more like relief. Like the particular quality of light when you finally walk out of a dark room. The first moment when your eyes hurt a little from the brightness and then adjust, and you realize how much you were missing. I told him this once, on a summer evening on the waterfront, the same waterfront where we had walked through winter and spring. The water was warm-looking now and the city was loud around us, the full open sound of summer, and he was standing next to me with his arm around my shoulder and his face turned slightly toward the water, and I said, I did not know it could feel like this. He said, like what? I said, like not being tired. Like having energy left over at the end of the day. He turned to look at me, and the expression was the full warm amber one. Unguarded and real, he said, I am glad, I said, it is because of you. I want you to know that. Not entirely, I know it is my own work too, but you made it possible in a way it was not before. You received something I had never allowed anyone to receive and you just held it. Without making it heavy. And that changed something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you let me. That is the part you are not giving yourself credit for. You let me in. That was the hard part, and you did it, I said, it was the hardest thing I have done in a long time, he said, I know. And you did it anyway. That is who you are. The city moved around us, warm and loud and indifferent in the way that cities are, full of a million other people managing their own interior architectures, their own careful structures, their own costs and silences and revelations, and we stood in the middle of all of it and I thought about the Tuesday in November, about the phone on the break room counter, about the automated voice saying my name on a line that should never have been answered. I thought, if I had not left my phone in the break room, I thought, if he had had a different case, I thought, if he had ended the call even 3 seconds sooner, the architecture of contingency. All the small structural choices that hold up a moment. Without which that moment does not exist. I leaned into him slightly, and he held on, easy and solid and warm. In August, almost a year after the phone on the break room counter, I came home from a long day at work and found a voicemail. This one was from the clinic too. The same clinic, the same automated voice, reminding me that my annual checkup was scheduled for the following week, and that my updated blood work would be reviewed at that appointment. I listened to it while standing in my kitchen, still in my jacket, bag still on my shoulder, and then I did something I had not done in 6 years. I called Marvin. He answered on the second ring and said, Hey, I said, I have a clinic appointment next week. The annual one, he said, okay. Do you want me to come with you? I said, you do not have to, he said, I know. Do you want me to? I said, yes, he said, then I will be there. What time? I told him. He said he would rearrange a site visit and that it was not a problem. He asked if I had eaten, and I said not yet, and he said he would pick up something from the place on my corner if I texted him my order, and I did, and 20 minutes later he was at my door with food and the easy normalcy of a person who had decided I was part of his life and was simply living accordingly. We ate dinner and I told him about my week and he told me about his, and after dinner he stayed, and we sat together in the quiet of my apartment with the summer dark outside the windows. He said, are you okay? I said, yes. I am actually okay. That is what I was calling to tell you, I think. Not just about the appointment. Just that I am okay. And that I wanted to tell you because you are the person I tell things to now. He looked at me, and the look was everything I had learned to read in a year of watching him, warm and steady and carrying the full weight of his attention. He said, I am glad you called. I said, it used to scare me. Calling someone just to say a thing. Because it assumed they wanted to receive it, he said, I always want to receive it. I said, I know that now. He reached across and took my hand, unhurried, matter of fact. His hand was warm. As it always was, and he held mine with the particular care he brought to everything he touched, as if he understood the structural value of what he was holding and intended to maintain it. I thought about the Tuesday in November. About the careful life I had built and the crack that appeared in it because of a wrong phone and a voicemail and an alpha who apologized for knowing something I had not chosen to tell him. I thought about the way he had said my name that first time. Seth. Low and careful and carrying the weight of what it was about to say. I had been careful for 6 years, I was still careful about some things, and I suspected I always would be, because care is not something you unlearn entirely. And there are forms of it that serve you well. But I was not careful in the old way, the way that was also a wall, the way that kept everything out including the things that were worth letting in. I was careful with the things that mattered. With the life I was building. With the man sitting next to me holding my hand in the summer dark, I said, "Marvin," he said. "Seth," I said, "I am going to say something and I want you to just listen." He said, "I am listening," I said. "A year ago I left my phone on the break room counter. It was an accident and it started the most frightening week I had experienced in years. And I would not change it. I want you to know that. I would not change one part of it. Not the voicemail, not the look on your face when I walked into your office, not any of it. Because it led here, and here is the best place I have ever been." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I would not change it either." "Although I am still sorry," I answered. I said, "I know. That is part of why I would not change it," he said. "That is a very specific logic," I said. "It is my logic and it works." He lifted my hand and pressed his lips to my knuckles, briefly, quietly, and then held it against his chest, and I could feel the slow steady rhythm of his heart under my palm, and I thought, this is what it feels like to have put something down and not picked it back up. This is what it feels like to arrive. Outside my window, the city was warm and loud and going about its business, full of people in the middle of their own stories, their own careful structures and their own slowly opening doors, and I was sitting in my apartment with my hand pressed to the heart of the man I loved, and the clinic voicemail had been on my phone for a year and now I returned those calls with someone else's number saved under the word Marvin, no last name needed, because there was only one person who went by that name in my life and always would be. I had been careful until it mattered more to be open, and the wrong phone call had been the first brick. I know that a life can be constructed out of necessity and still be a life. That the structures we build to protect ourselves are real and have their own integrity and deserve their own respect, even when we are ready to build something different. I know that being known is not the same as being exposed. That the difference is the presence of someone who receives what you give them without using it as a weight. I know that Alpha and Omega, as categories, are smaller than the people who carry them. That what Marvin Conrad is to me has almost nothing to do with what either of our designations are, and almost everything to do with the specific, singular, unrepeatable fact of him. The way he listens. The way he builds things to last. The way he said my name in a quiet office on a Tuesday in November. Like it was something worth being careful with. I know that the waterfront is best at 8 in the morning on a Sunday in October, when the light is gold and the air is cold and the city has not yet fully woken up, and when the person walking beside you is close enough that your shoulders touch without effort and neither of you needs to say anything about it because you are both already saying everything. I know that I left my phone on the break room counter and the wrong man answered it and the right thing happened. I know that careful and open are not opposites. They are a spectrum, and you find your place on it, and your place changes, and that is not a failure of either end. It is just what living looks like when you are doing it for real. I know that I love Marvin Conrad with the full, unmanaged, uncollared weight of everything I am, and that this is the most terrifying and most ordinary thing in my life, and that ordinary, after everything, is exactly what I wanted. I know that he knows too, and I know that on the first Sunday of every month, he still brings 2 cups of coffee to my office, made exactly the way I like it, and sets one on the corner of my desk. Without making a production of it, and I drink it, and it is the closest thing I have to a ritual. And I know that when he leaves, he always says Seth, and I always say Marvin, and the name sounds like home. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want to listen to stories early, get bonus content, or just support the channel, my Patreon link is in the description. It means the world.